now let's jump in. And what we're going to do today is, again, it's specifically for the InsightWorks Advanced Inventory Count module. So this doesn't apply to sort of base NAV physical inventories or anything like that. Beginner to intermediate or even advanced. If you have any questions, as Brian mentioned, just spit them out in the question box. Brian will interrupt me, and I'll answer them right then and there. So don't be afraid about asking any questions. All right, let's get started. So the first thing I want to cover is what the process is for the count at a high level, and then we'll dig through the different configuration options and everything on how we set that up and how we execute it. So when we talk about the count process, we first have to recognize that there's really three different types of counts. We don't care about ad hoc for the purposes of this training. That's more sort of an operational sort of reactive type thing. What we care about are these top two. And you have the option of doing what we call a directed count. Now that has nothing to do with the directed pick and put away that we asked you about at the beginning. That just means that the system is going to tell you what you need to go out there and count. And that's basically it. That's what most people are used to, especially if you're coming from the standard NAV physical inventory, where you generate you calculate inventory and it tells you what you need to go out and count. The other way we can do it is non-directed. And in that case, we don't generate count sheets. We don't generate a list of items to count. You simply go out there and scan everything you find. So for year-end inventory, for full inventory counts, that is the ideal approach typically, because you're just scanning everything you find in the facility. And then from within NAV, we can reconcile that and figure out if we screwed up anywhere. So the basic process for doing that count, the first thing we do is we define count sheets. So whether you do the directed count or the non-directed count, you would go in and first define the count sheets that you need to store your inventory count. Okay, and we'll get into this a little bit, but you can name those whatever you like. They're very similar to a NAV batch, a NAV item journal batch as an example, just a little more comprehensive and things like that. But a typical one, if you're using a scanner, is you'll name the sheets based on the teams doing the count. So if you have 10 scanners out there, you might have team 1 to team 10, or scanner 1 to scanner 10, or whatever you want to call that. That's a typical thing. So anyway, we define the count sheets. We optionally generate the count sheet lines. So if you're doing that directed count where you're telling people what they need to go out and count, then you would use that functionality to get a list of those items. That's very similar to the calculate inventory in the NAV physical inventory journal or warehouse physical inventory journal. Right. Then we're going to go into the scanner. We're going to use the count application, and we're going to go ahead and scan everything that we find, or everything that we're directed to find, and record the results. Now, once we've done that, that's sort of executing the count. Everybody goes out, scans things. That's coming into NAV. Once it's in NAV, we have to go ahead and reconcile and validate that inventory count. So the first step there is we generate a master sheet, a baseline sheet. I'll talk about that in a moment. We can do this actually at the beginning of the count, which is actually my preferred approach, is we go on at the beginning of the count and create a master sheet, but it just needs to exist before you start doing the reconciliation. And the reconciliation consists of running the count difference report or looking at the count summary page. And what that will do is tell us where we screwed up, where our discrepancies are. And then we can optionally generate recount sheets to go out and double check items. We don't have to use recount sheets. You can double check items and just change the initial count quantity, or you can use the recount sheet functionality to create a sort of an audit trail of my original count, my recounts. Once we've gone in and corrected all the information, we simply copy that data to the standard NAV journals. So for, I think it was roughly 60% of you are using directed pick and put away. That copies it to the warehouse physical inventory journal and the physical inventory journal, and you post those and you're off to the races. Okay, so that's the rough count. We generate the sheets, we scan everything, we come back in, we do the reconciliation, you make corrections, you copy to the journals, and you post, or somebody in accounting posts or whatever. All right, now let's talk a little bit about how we get to that point. So the first step is just to look at how the thing is laid out. So we start out with an inventory count card. So the inventory count card really is the container for everything we're doing on the count. It's what we use to manage the information for that specific inventory count. And as it says here, it's typically one card per location. So, if you have multiple warehouses, you would create, one inventory count card per warehouse. However, you can have one card for multiple locations. And where you would do that is, let's say you have a virtual scrap location within your warehouse. Well, you may want to count that on the same inventory count as your standard warehouse, because it makes reconciliation a little easier. For example, I could see, I'm short 100 of this item in my main warehouse, but look, I've got 100 extra in my scrap warehouse. And it may help you to reconcile those types of things a little more easily. But typically we have one inventory count card per location. Within that count card, we have count sheets, which I described earlier. It's just where we're going to stick everything we scan. And then we have count lines, which is what we scanned in or what we've generated for people to go ahead and scan. The inventory count setup you can use to control how the sheets are generated. For example, adding expiration dates when we generate the lot numbers, those types of things. Most people will never really have to look at this. If you're doing printing out count sheets, then you can specify the report you use to print and those types of things. But pretty straightforward. Most of the time, nobody has to look at this inventory count setup at all. Well, actually, I lie there. If you're doing a directed count where you're sending people out to find product to scan, one of the options is, and you have to be on directed put away and pick. One of the options is to choose a default unit of measure to scan in or to generate those count sheet lines. And you can use a put away or a purchase unit of measure instead of the base unit of measure if you like. Okay, so with directed put away and pick, you can do counts. Well, with all of the location configurations, you can do counts in different units of measure. With directed put away and pick, you can have different units of measure per bin that you can count. Okay. All right, inventory as of date. So this one's an important one because this one controls really, at what point we cut off the transactions that we do reconciliation against. And what I mean by that is we don't actually freeze the inventory. So if you go in and you calculate inventory on a physical inventory journal in NAV, that kind of locks the inventory, kind of freezes it on that journal, until you're done. And the problem with that is if you want to pre-plan your count sheets, if you're doing a directed count where you're deciding certain people have to count certain product, you may want to pre-plan that weeks or days in advance. And so we don't lock that inventory. We allow you to build up your count sheets and everything else and plan your count out ahead of time. And then we use this as of date to control how we reconcile the inventory. So for example, if I set my inventory as of date to December 31st, it's going to only look at all the transactions up to that date when it's comparing what the differences are. So if I start doing transactions on January 2nd, as long as I don't backdate them, they're not going to be included in any of the reconciliation or any of the adjustments. So it's sort of like freezing inventory, but it gives you a lot more flexibility because you can change that date and all sorts of stuff to allow you to pre-plan that inventory. Now there's a note down here. I won't go through it in a lot of detail. When you get the recording, you can go through this, but ideally, you don't want to do transactions until you've posted the count. Now, the as of date makes it possible to do that, but there are situations where if you've done an invalid count, an incorrect count, and you try and post it, even though we don't look at, transactions after the 31st, that can still result in a negative adjustment that can't happen when you have bins mandatory. All right. So ideally, try not to do transactions before you post the inventory, but if you do, other than, if you had an invalid count, everything should work fine based on this inventory as of date. All right. Now, recalculating differences, that's if you do use that as of date. So you'll see when I go into my samples here, we can set up, pre-plan the inventory count sheets for the end of the month. And it'll bring in the current inventory levels when I plan that. So when I get down to the point where I actually want to do my count, I would run the recalculate differences command, and that'll bring in the current inventory based on the current date or the as of date, so that I can do my discrepancy reporting. Okay. All right, so let's talk about count sheets a little bit. So generating count sheets, you do for two reasons. One, you're doing that directed count where you go in and you set filters and everything else, and you generate sheets for people to run out and count. The other time is that master sheet I talked about. So the master sheet, the purpose of that, or baseline sheet, the purpose of that is to address anything that you may have missed if you're doing either a directed or non-directed count. So the system will only adjust inventory for the items that are on the count sheets. So essentially, everything you've scanned is what it looks at. If you've missed items, if you didn't scan some items because they're hiding behind something else or whatever, those won't actually get touched. They'll just stay in stock the way they are. So a master sheet, what that does is it brings in all the on-hand inventory, or at least the on-hand inventory that NAV thinks should be there, onto a baseline sheet, so that if I don't count one of those items, the baseline sheet will have a value of 0 for that count. So essentially everything on that master sheet will get adjusted to 0 unless I've counted it somewhere else, okay? So you have to use it for non-directed counts. For directed counts, it's not a bad thing to do anyway, just to make sure when you generated those count sheets, you didn't miss anything. But there is also a uncounted parts report you can run for directed counts to make sure that all the filters and everything you set up actually covered all of the products you want to count. All right. Now, sheet filters, when we generate a count sheet, you have a lot of different filters you can use. So you can filter typically by bin is a common one, but you can filter by item type, by item tracking, or any custom filters that you want to add to that specific count sheet line. And that allows you to segregate your inventory onto different count sheets for different people to count. Right? So let's actually have a look at how all of this sort of fits together, and then we'll come back to the PowerPoint and review some more fun stuff. So what I've got is on here, I've got my a few count sheets generated. I've got one for a bin mandatory location, one for a directed pick location, one that doesn't have bins at all. And I'll just open this first one here. And you'll see I've set the as of date to the end of December. And I've created a couple of different count sheets here, Team 1 and Team 2. And that's what people are going to be scanning into on the scanners. And so again, I can prepare this ahead of time. And when I go to actually start the count, or before I do my reconciliation, I would simply come in here and I would go recalculate all differences, and it would bring in the current inventory levels, based on this date. Now, what I've got here is, the count sheet name, Team 1. I've already generated sheets, but I'm going to do it again here. Blank sheet quantity. If you're printing out sheets, this gives you a blank sheet to write things in. Block bins, more used for cycle counting, but what you can do is you can actually prevent people from doing transactions on those bins that you're counting. Okay, so normally full count, you'd ignore that. If you did want to have a different location, so I mentioned, where we've got the count card for silver, but let's say within that silver warehouse, I had a scrap location or something, I could have a sheet for a different location in here as well. But over here is where we get actually to the filtering, where I can come in and I can filter by bin code or shelf number, any of this criteria here, to reduce what items I see on the count sheet itself. Okay, so now typically, again, this is used for directed count if I'm generating the sheets. For full inventory counts, I prefer the non-directed, where you just give somebody a scanner and they go out and they scan everything they find. But if you do want to generate it, this is how you can segregate those sheets and provide different things for different people to count. So in my case, I said, any bin that starts with SO1 is going to be Team 1's responsibility, and everything else in the warehouse is going to be Team 2's responsibility. But you can break that out however you like. And there's also a custom filter capability here. So if there's fields that aren't in the default filter, you can come in and you can build up your own filters. So for example, if I wanted to have Team 1, count everything for a specific vendor, I could come in there and say, if the vendor is, give it a sec to load up, these guys or whatever, I can go ahead and build up that custom filter with whatever fields, and it will restrict all the count sheet lines to whatever this custom filter is, in addition to all the other filters I've specified. Okay, so that's a little bit on the filtering side. So once you've set this up, so again, in my case, I've said team 1 is going to count these bins, team 2 is going to count these bins. I would go in and hit generate sheets. And when I do that, it gives me the ability to specify a few different transactional options. So for example, at minimum, you probably want to include inventory. So when you include inventory, that means anything that NAV thinks is in stock is going to go on that count sheet. This empty bins inactivity period, what this allows me to do is say, when I bring something in that's supposed to be in stock, well, maybe that item, lives in 3 different bins, and one of those bins is empty. So if it's been empty for 5 days or less, I specified 5 days here, that empty bin will show up on the count sheet as a double check, if you will. Okay, so that's, if we leave that blank, or if I set that to a very short time frame, that will actually exclude all the empty bins for an item, even though that item is in stock. It'll only show only the bins with quantities in those bins. Okay. Include active items allows me to specify items that aren't in stock, but have had a transaction within a recent time frame. So I've set 5 years here because I'm in the Cronus database and it doesn't have a lot of recent data. But you might say, anything that I've had a transaction for in the last 2 weeks, even though NAV doesn't think it's in stock, I want people to go and find it and double check that there really is 0 in stock for that particular item. Okay, so I'm going to do 5 years worth of activity. And then inactive items, it's only useful in certain cases. I would just ignore that. This use SKUs, if you use stock keeping units and you have a stock keeping unit for every item, this can potentially speed things up when you generate the count sheets, but normally you can just leave that blank. There's a few other options here under cycle count and miscellaneous. For full inventory counts, you can kind of ignore those. So essentially all I'm doing is I'm coming in here, I'm saying, yeah, show me everything that's in stock, where, and include any bins that have been active within the last 5 days, and any inactive items. And when I hit go, well, it yells at me because I've got, existing count sheets records to find. But I say, yeah, let's go ahead and kill those, and it'll go through and it'll generate those sheets, and I've got exactly the same numbers, which makes sense, and I've generated my sheets. Okay, so again, this is for a directed count where I'm generating the sheets, and I open this up, and on the scanner, if I open this up, this is exactly what I'm going to see. I'm going to see the bin code and the item number. I'm going to scan those and enter the quantities. Now, for a non-directed count, it's much simpler. A non-directed count, it could be, that could have been a non-directed as well, but I would simply come in here. Here's an example in a different location. I just create all the count sheets. I don't bother setting any filters or anything like that. I just create the count sheets, and I don't generate. I just say, Joe, you're handheld 1 today. He goes to the scanner and he starts scanning in, and it'll build up the count sheets as he goes. All right. Now, on this particular one, because it is a count where I'm not generating the count sheets ahead of time, again, if they go out and scan, 5 items each, but I have 500 items in the system that should be on hand, it's not going to touch all those items they didn't scan. So that's where we want to build that master sheet. So what I would do, and I typically do this before the count starts, just so you don't screw it up and accidentally overwrite things that people have scanned in already. But I would come in here and create a master sheet, or call it baseline, or whatever the heck you want to do. And then, you leave all the filters and everything blank, and you go into generate count sheets, and essentially you just come in and you say, anything that's in stock, I want to add to my master sheet. And when you generate that, it does exactly what you'd expect. It goes through the system, grabs everything that's in stock, adds it onto my baseline, and now if I counted 60 items instead of 65 as an example, those 5 I didn't count would show up as not being counted and would get adjusted down to 0. The other way you can do that is there is a uncounted parts report, where if you run that, it will tell you which items weren't on the count sheets but are in stock. So that's an alternate way of doing it. And you can use that to actually add those items to a new count sheet if you like, but it's not as robust as doing the master sheet. Like, it doesn't take into account serial numbers and lot numbers and all those sorts of things. But for some counts, this might be a quicker way to do it. This is often quicker if you're doing that directed count where I've generated a bunch of count sheets, I can now run this to make sure I didn't set up a filter that excludes a bunch of items that I should have counted. All right. So that's basically it. That's how we set up the count sheet. So the first example again was, I generated some items for people to count, and I can print those out if I like. So you can go ahead and print the inventory count sheets, and you can give that to somebody with a scanner. So if I come in here and print this count sheet, this again is more for paper-based, but they do have a barcode that I can scan from the scanner and load up this count sheet on the scanner. Okay, but the first example, I went in, I created some count sheets, I generated, I told them what they need to go ahead and count, and that is very similar to what you would do in standard nav. The difference is in standard nav you might have different batches or something like that, assuming you're using directed pick and put away. If you're not using or bin mandatory mostly, if you don't have bins mandatory, then you're stuck with one count sheet essentially for the entire organization, which is a good point. If you don't have bins mandatory, well, there are a few people that aren't using bins, you don't have to filter by bin. You can filter by shelf number. You can have the same item on multiple count sheets, no problem. Okay, and it'll sum it up automatically for you. All right, so if you don't have bins mandatory and you've got some items on the east side of the warehouse and the same item on the west side, different people count those items, it'll bring it in and sum it up automatically for you. All right, so that's again generating the count sheets. The other example was I didn't generate any count sheets other than this master reconciliation sheet here, but handheld 1 and handheld 2 or team 1 and team 2, they're not being told what to go out and count. Okay, I think I've killed that pretty well. Let's go back to the presentation and talk a little bit about item tracking. So, nav is it's pretty nice and flexible on how you can set up item tracking, but it does cause issues. So there's a whole bunch of different ways you can set up item tracking, i.e. lot numbers and serial numbers. So, optional tracking where you only record the lot and serial number in certain situations, like, at shipment instead of all the way through the system. You can also turn it on if you don't have bins mandatory. You can turn it on with bins mandatory, but non-warehouse item tracking, which means that I know I've got 10 serial numbers of this item in stock, but I don't know which bins they're in. And then we can also turn it on with bins mandatory, and I know I've got 10 serial numbers, and they're located in these 3 bins. I know exactly which serial number or lot number is in each bin. And then finally, there's warehouse item tracking, so we know which serial number or lot number is in which bin, and we're also using the directed put away and pick functionality. So all of those work differently in nav, and therefore the count module handles every one of these situations differently, and it's a real pain in the butt. But so I'm not sure if which we didn't poll on asking how people have this set up, but we'll cover off a little bit of how each of these works. Now, one question we often get when people generate the count sheets, it doesn't generate the lot numbers or serial numbers on the count sheets. So I generate that count sheet, and I've got it shows me a serialized item and it gives me a quantity of 20 with no serial number breakdown. Well, that'll happen if one of these 2 criteria isn't met. So if you don't have bins mandatory and you do have the item tracking enabled, the count sheets will explode out to show you 1 count sheet per serial number or lot number. Or if you have bins mandatory and you have the warehouse item tracking enabled, it will also generate 1 count sheet line per lot number or serial number. No other configuration will do that. You'll get 1 line that says go count 20 serial numbers, and it won't break out those serial numbers. All right. You can use the count sheet report if you're doing paper-based reports and things like that to help break it out. But the reasoning behind that is, just to sort of justify this, is let's say I've got 30 serial numbers in stock, and that item is stored in 3 different bins. Well, we don't know which serial number is in which bin, so we'd actually have to list every serial number for each bin in order to identify those serial numbers, which means we'd have to generate 90 count sheet lines to cover off all those possibilities. So that's not really a good way of doing things. It's just confusing for the users, and it's just a big mess. So we just give you 1 line, and then on the scanner you can scan in all the serial numbers and it'll automatically plug them in, no problem. All right, so executing the count. Now that we've gone in to find our count sheets, all of that kind of stuff, we want to actually do this. So you can print out the count sheets like I showed you that has a barcode on it. You hand the piece of paper to somebody so they scan it, so there's no confusion about which count sheet they should be using. And, paper-based might be nice to jot things down on or whatever. Otherwise, employees can go into the scanner and just choose the count sheet that they've been assigned without having to scan anything and start working with it. Once they've loaded up that count sheet on the handheld, there's a few different ways they can scan things in. The most typical is they're going to scan a bin code, an item code, and then they're going to enter the quantity. That is the most typical. Bin, item, quantity. If you don't have bins enabled, it's just item and quantity. Now, there are a couple other things like a tag barcode, which I'll talk about in a moment. Or if you're using license plating, I can scan a pallet, and then I won't have to enter quantities or anything like that. This quantity is optional because you might have that quantity in the barcode. So some people in foods and things like that, they actually have the quantity, weights, whatever, in the barcode, so that the employee wouldn't actually have to enter that quantity. On the scan behaviors within Warehouse Insight, you can also set it up to default the quantity in based on the remaining quantity of that particular lot number that you scan. So there's a few options there that you can use that may cause the employee not to have to enter a quantity. But again, bin, item, quantity is the standard approach. Okay, now when they scan that, that sequence, what the system will do is it'll try to find an existing line that matches what they've scanned. So it'll find, by bin, item, and lot number and serial number. It'll try and find that line. If a line doesn't exist on that count sheet, even if it's a directed count, it'll append a line to the count sheet. Okay, so even if you're doing a directed count where you say, go count these 10 items, and they're out there counting and they find something in a bin that wasn't on their count sheet, they can still scan that in. Okay. And then for advanced warehousing, I mentioned that, we can have different units of measure per bin. So when I scan, if I've scanned in, say, eaches in a bin, and then I scan in a barcode that cross-references or that's for a case, the system can either add a line for cases, or you can be prompted to update the existing line that you counted in eaches. Okay, so you have that option when we're using the advanced warehousing with multiple units of measure per bin, which I don't really recommend, by the way, for obvious reasons. It can make things very confusing for employees. At any rate, let's talk a little bit about the tag numbers. So, and bins. So you can scan a bin even if you aren't using bins within the system. And the reason you'd want to do that is it helps segregate the inventory. So if you have to do a recount, you know exactly where that item was counted. So even if you have temporary barcodes that you use at different areas of the warehouse with essentially anything you want on them, you can scan them in and it will load it into the bin code field in the system to help facilitate finding that product for recounts and everything else. Okay, so you don't have to have bins mandatory to be able to scan the bin code. The other option is a tag barcode, which allows you to scan a shelf number. So it doesn't go in the bin field, it goes in the shelf number field. And the nice thing about this is you can actually have the bin code and the shelf number in a barcode, and it'll put both of those on the count line at the same time. And the advantage of that is that it splits large bins into smaller areas. So for example, if I have a bulk storage bin that's, the back wall of the warehouse that's, 60 feet long, if I'm counting in there and I have to do a recount, I don't want to go searching that whole area for, the item that I counted somewhere in that bin. So what you can do is you can break up that bin using a tag barcode into smaller areas. So every 10 feet, they can, stick a tag on there, scan a barcode, and now within that 10-foot area, that's everything I counted in that area. And the next 10 feet, this is what I counted in that area, and so on and so forth. So for those of you that have larger bins and want to break them up into smaller bins, you can generate barcodes out of Excel or whatever you like, and use those to break up those bins. All right. So let's actually have a look at how we do that count from a scanner. So I'm going to go in, and I've got, this device in my hand. If you've seen previous demos, I've got this Falcon device here, and I'm going to scan a bunch of barcodes. So the way it works, of course, is you go into the count application on the handheld. Now, we do have two different count applications for the handheld. One is the standard count, one is the advanced count. The advanced count is just called count. That's the one you want. We go into that, and what it will do is it gives me a list of all the count sheets in my location. So you'll notice that this location here is the white location. So the scanner is set up to work with the white location, and these are the count sheets in that particular location. And I will mention, you can see on here, you can actually see the master sheet. So sometimes people prefer to do the master sheet after so that nobody can jump in here and poke around in there and mess things up. But what the employee will do at this point, they'll either scan the barcode from that count sheet report, or they just know that they're handheld 1 today and they can choose handheld 1 and start to count. So what they'll do, choose that count sheet, and then as I mentioned, they'll simply walk up, they'll scan the first bin that they're at. Again, this is the non-directed version. They'll scan the item they found in that particular bin, or item and lot number, or item and serial number, whatever is required, and enter the quantity they've counted. Okay, simple as that. Now, again, if it's a lot tracked or serialized item, if the lot number or serial number is in the barcode, it'll come in automatically. Otherwise, it'll prompt them to either manually enter it or scan a secondary barcode for the lot number or serial number, and away we go. I will mention a couple other things here. It says, please scan a bin first. So I've got it set up to forget the bin every time I enter a quantity. That's a setting within the Warehouse Insight configurations, where you can, for certain people, you can have it remember the bin that they scanned. So again, if I'm scanning in the bulk area, I just want to scan the bin barcode once, and then I'm going to scan 300 items. But if I'm scanning on the racks, you'll want it to forget the bin so that they have to scan the bin each and every time. So I scan the bin, I scan the barcode again, and I'll just mention a couple of things. Depending on what version you're on, there's the calculator option. So if you're counting different units to measure, they give it in there. They're supposed to be counting in pieces, but there's 12 cases of 9 per case or 13 per case or something like that. You can hit the little calculator button to do some basic math here for the employee if they need to multiply things out. And they can also choose a different unit of measure. So if you do actually track multiple units of measure within NAV, I could go ahead and count in a different unit of measure as well. Okay, and it'll do that conversion automatically for me. But that's basically it. So I go in there, scan bin, scan item, enter quantity. That's how I do my count. Okay. And you'll notice when we get in here, we've got the 2 lines that I scanned. If I click on that, I can open it up, and there's the 2 lines, and it's not rocket magic. It's pretty straightforward. Right. Doesn't look like there's any questions yet. Either I don't know if that's good or bad, but we'll keep going. All right, so now that I've scanned everything in, oh, and by the way, the directed count is exactly the same. The difference is when I go to the handheld, instead of starting out with a blank sheet, I'll use master as an example because that's a generated sheet. Instead of starting out with a blank sheet, what I would get is I'd get a list of all the items that I'm supposed to go out and count. So it gives me the bin, gives me the item. I would simply go to that bin, scan it, scan the item, whatever I like. I can do it out of order if I want. I can, again, scan things that aren't on this count sheet and it'll automatically add it, those types of things. Okay, so the directed count is really not a lot different from an execution perspective. The only difference is they actually have to find what's listed on this screen and scan it in. Okay, and this little button here you can tap to give you a little more real estate on the screen if you really wanted. All right, so let's get back into reconciling. So we talked about the master sheet already. I'm going to skip this slide completely because I've covered it all. Now, there's a couple of different ways you can reconcile it. One is line level differences. So on those count sheet lines, it actually has a bunch of fields that indicate what the differences are on a per line level. Okay, and I won't get into the details of how it calculates what the expected quantity is, but it's either based on the bin that you're in or the lot number or the serial number or the quantity on hand, depending on the configuration of that particular item. So there is an expected quantity field on that line, as well as on hand and bin on hand and a bunch of other things like that, or bin content. And it gives you the difference quantity and difference amount for each individual line. Now that can be useful, if you have bin mandatory and things like that, you can tell per bin where you're out, but it doesn't give you the full picture of the count, because maybe I counted 0 in bin A and there was supposed to be 100, but I actually counted 100 in bin B. So the net result is 0, but if I'm looking at it line by line, it looks like I've got significant discrepancies. Okay, so line by line can be useful, but really when we're doing the reconciliation, we want to use the count difference analysis report or the count difference summary page. Normally I like the pages better because they're more interactive and things like that. In this case, I actually tend to like the report a little better, but both are available for doing your analysis. Okay, so what they'll do is they'll go out and they'll figure out what your discrepancies are and show them either by lot number or serial number, depending on how you set that up. The one nice thing about the count difference summary for some people is you can export that to Excel. So if people want to do analysis a little differently than what the report offers or what the page offers, you can export it to Excel, you can pivot it, you can do whatever the heck you want to help identify where your issues are. Okay, and let's actually have a look at that. So now that I've done my count, so I've sent people out, they've done a massive count here, we've counted 2 items, and again, because we did that baseline, when I run the reconciliation, it's going to incorporate everything on this master sheet as well as what's being counted. Okay, so what we do after everything's being counted, we run the count difference analysis, and we have a number of different options here. You always want all inventory. It does have the ability to do web counts, but I'm not going to talk about that. If we want to do all inventory, and you can show the description and the details, and what the details are gives you a breakdown of who counted what and where. But for the first pass, you'd leave that off. You may also want to show the item tracking issue. So when you turn this on, this will give you your breakdown of which lot numbers and serial numbers you've missed or screwed up on. Okay, so you can turn that on as well if you like. And then what I'm normally going to do is sort by amount. So this is the discrepancy amount. So all inventory amount, that's the default settings when you first start it up. And when I hit preview, it's basically going to go through and give me all of the discrepancies on that particular count. And depending on the number of lines you have, that might take a couple minutes to run. But yeah, it should be fairly quick. So you can see here, this particular item, I'm short $10,000. I'm missing 30, a quantity of 30, and I'm short $10,000. The next one about 10,000. This one here, that's one of the ones I counted. I've got an extra 97, and I'm up by $3,500. Okay, so it sorts it by the absolute difference value. So you can go in here and see everything that's wrong. And if you scroll down to the bottom, it gives you your total differences and your absolute total differences. And the reason you want to look at the total absolute number is because offsetting entries tend to hide problems in your count. So I've got item A, I was short of $10,000 of item A, but item B, I had an extra $10,000. Completely unrelated items, both completely way out of whack, but they offset. And if I look at my total differences, hey, my count was awesome. I had $0 difference. When in fact, my actual difference, my absolute difference would have been $20,000 in that scenario. Okay, so the total absolute differences is a better indicator of how much variability you had in that particular count. Okay, so anyway, we look at this thing. And this is one option for doing the reconciliation. And again, I could run that again and show all the serial numbers and lot numbers that I'm missing or that it counted extra, those types of things. I can also use the count difference summary page to do essentially the same thing. So when I do that, it runs the same analysis and brings it up. And now I can come in here and scroll through this. And down here, it gives me my lot number and serial number discrepancies at the bottom. Or if you want to export this to Excel for analysis and you want to do it by lot number and serial number, if you turn on this group by tracking, what it will do now is it'll break that out by lot number and serial number. So in the main list, I can see all the discrepancies at the lot number or serial number level as well. Okay, so I can see the discrepancy here. So this can be exported to Excel for further analysis if you really like.
Hey, Mark.
Okay. Yes.
I've got a question here from Sarah. Does the difference amount calculate on unit cost or standard cost?
That's unit cost. So it's using the unit cost, which is actually a very good point. Thank you for mentioning that. So when we do this count difference analysis, I'll just run this here. This total here at the bottom is based on the unit cost, in other words, the average cost of that particular item. So when you actually copy this count to the journals and you run the test report for the journals, that total may be different than what you see here. So there may be some discrepancies. It's usually not all that significant. But this is, you know, really a guideline for the inventory people doing the count. When we get to the journals, that may be a slightly different number because it's going to be using standard costing, or the negative adjustment is applying to an older entry with a different average cost, or whatever. Okay. Right.
Okay.
That good? Any other questions?
Yeah, one other one popped in here. Does the count correct the lot number? For example, item A inventory, quantity equals one lot 1, but physical count is lot 2.
Yes, so I'll get into that in just a moment. We'll have a look at that. So all of those differences that you saw there by serial number or lot number, if I post it like that or copy to the journals like that, it will actually copy those adjustments automatically. So you don't have to type in the lot numbers or serial numbers to adjust. It'll do that automatically. Okay, and that specific scenario that was mentioned, I'll talk about in a moment here. Okay, good. Let's go back to this. Now, recounts. So recounts are good for full physical counts. So if you go in there and you spot all those discrepancies and you want to send people off to do recounts, you have really two options. One, you know, you write something down on a Post-it note and stick it to his forehead or something, and he goes out and counts it again. And when you come back, you manually type it in, or he uses the scanner to go and load up his existing count sheet and scan that item again. So that's fine, but it doesn't really give you much traceability or auditing for that particular item. So what we'd prefer to use is the recount functionality within the system. So we can generate recount sheets automatically based on you know, a predefined threshold for variance, or you can manually go in and just select random items to recount. And that selecting random items is great if you have auditors coming in, because they'll want to spot check certain items, and you can just go in there and flag that for a recount. And what it does is it generates a new sheet for the scanner or paper that people can go out and address those specific items, and then we can see what the original count quantity was, what the recount was, and so on and so forth. So let's actually have a quick peek at how that works. So the sort of the big one is this generate recount sheets. And what I can do there is I can come in, actually before I do that, let's actually create a recount sheet for us. So we're going to do recount 1 here. So that's going to be my first recount pass, or team 1's recount, and I can have recount 2, recount 3, or name them whatever you like. And what I can do now is I can go in here and I can say, you know what, I'm going to, anything that's out by more than $10,000 or anything that's out by more than 5%, I'm automatically going to add that to a recount sheet. And it's going to, again, create a link to the original count quantity and now generate this new recount sheet that I can send people out to count. If you look at the manual, if you don't have the manual, we can send it to you. But this compare thresholds, this controls what, you know, how we trigger that recount. So for example, if I say item number, it's going to sum up all the quantities and amounts per item number. And if that on an item basis exceeds this threshold, it'll add it to a recount sheet. If I choose count line, then each count line individually has to exceed this threshold. Okay. And if I choose item number, what it will do is every item that was counted will automatically get added to the recount sheet. Okay. So that's the first way. We run this, it builds up my recount sheet, and then I can send people out to scan it. The other way of doing it, as I mentioned, the spot check way. If I open this up in an auditor or I personally want to go in and do it, so here's that expected quantity I mentioned. So I can look at this and I can see, wow, this is way out, you know, for this particular bin or lot number or whatever. You know, I expected 0, they counted 123. I'm just going to flag this for a recount. So I can go in, select multiple items, hit copy to recount sheet, choose my recount. And what that does is now if I go in here and try and modify the original count quantity, it will fail because I have to send people out to do that recount. So what I'm going to do is on the handheld, I say, Mark, go out and do that recount. So he comes in, grabs the recount sheet, or scans the barcode if you print it out. And here's everything on that recount sheet he has to go and find and scan. So he goes and finds the bin, he finds the item, and this time, he found 12 instead of 123, let's say. And again, back in NAV here, if we go to our recount sheet, we've now got that count of 12. And what happens when we run the difference analysis report now, and I'll just do it for that one item to make it easier to find. What we got, I need to do that again. I forgot to turn on the details. So now if we show details and we run that guy, we can actually see the net result of that. So what we can see is I was supposed to have 26. I actually counted 12. I'm short 14, and here's where we end up. Here's the handheld one. They counted 123. Here's the recount where they counted 12 as opposed to the 123. And so what the system does is it sums all this stuff up and gives me my total. So I get that audit trail of my counts to my recounts. And there is the ability to filter out the master sheet so you don't see all of these guys, but in this case you may want to see it because clearly they didn't count any of those. Okay. All right, so that's a little bit on the recount functionality. Very useful in larger counts because it does help you manage those recounts a lot better. You've got individual sheets to control what's being recounted rather than just updates to the existing count lines. Okay. All right. Let's talk about posting. So on the inventory count card, there's a posting tab where you can set these options along with some batches. And I'll just run through what these options do. So the set item tracking lines will copy the lot number and serial number adjustments to the journals, right? And it may cause reclass journals to be created as well. And we'll talk about why the reclass journal gets created in a sec. The use batch document numbers, the bottom line is just leave this off. That's your best bet. Post zero differences, what you want to do is, if you've got a large number of this is more useful for cycle counts. If you have a large number of items that you've counted that have no discrepancies, you may want to leave this off just from a posting perspective. Now, if you've only got 10,000 or 20,000 items or something like that, that's not going to cause an issue. We did have an issue recently where somebody had, they have a lot of variance per item and they generated their count sheets. They actually generated, 850,000 count sheet lines. And then they turned this on when they copied the count to the journal, and they ended up with 800,000 lines on their item journal, on their physical inventory journal, and wondered why it was taking a long time to do anything. So as long as you don't have 800,000 lines on your count sheet, you could probably turn that on, right? So 50, 100,000 should be just fine. But it is more useful for cycle counts than anything else. Update next count period, that's also typically used for cycle counts, but I would leave that on. What that'll do, if you're using the physical inventory count period code, this will update the next counting period fields for future cycle counts if you're using that functionality. And the last one, use the default dimensions. So typically we see when people are doing inventory counts, they'll want to add a dimension for a reason code or flag it as physical inventory. And there is another field on the posting tab that allows you to specify certain dimensions to use on those journals. And if you specify alternate dimensions, you can turn this off. So it'll only use the alternate dimensions, or you can force it to use the standard dimension handling from NAV. Okay. All right. So you'd set all those things, and then you have to set some journals on that tab. And the journals that are available are the physical inventory, warehouse physical inventory, and Reclass Journal. The Reclass Journal you set when you're doing that copy item tracking lines or set item tracking lines. And there was a question, what if I'm supposed to have lot number 1 in stock, but I count lot number 2, same quantity? Well, there's no quantity difference for that particular lot number, but the lot number changed. So in a case like that, it will create a reclass journal entry to change it from lot number 1 to lot number 2. So the actual journal, physical inventory journal line will have a quantity of 0, but the reclass journal will reclass whatever 10 of lot 1 to 10 of lot 2. Okay, so that's when the reclass journal is used, when there's no inventory discrepancies, but there are lot or serial number discrepancies, it'll create that. Okay, reclass journal is not used to move items from bin to bin. So if I'm supposed to have items in bin A, but I count them in bin B, we're going to see a negative adjustment on A and a positive adjustment on B. We're not going to see a reclass entry for that. Okay. Now, lot and serial number handling. So another question we get is, the lot number and serial numbers don't make sense on the item journal. You've turned on set tracking lines and you look at the lot numbers and serial numbers and they don't make sense. Well, the only way that lot numbers and serial numbers make sense on the physical inventory journal and warehouse physical inventory journal is if you have specific tracking turned on. Okay, and then you can have warehouse tracking turned on as well. But if you don't have that specific tracking turned on, NAV doesn't track what lot or serial numbers you have in stock, right? If I buy serial number 1 and I buy serial number 2, and then I sell serial number 2, it's going to actually take serial number 1 out of stock if I don't have specific tracking turned on. So essentially, NAV has no idea what serial numbers or lot numbers are in stock if you don't have this turned on. So therefore, we don't know what to adjust in or out, and you may end up with things that don't make sense. So really, if you don't have specific tracking turned on, there's really no point in counting lot numbers and serial numbers during your count. Okay, it really adds no value at all. Okay. All right. So once I've copied everything to the journal, so what I would do is I would actually run the copy journals function, and it'll move everything over to the journals. I can then use the test report on the physical inventory journal to validate that there's no problems with that particular count. Okay. Now, when we copy over to the journals, we copy to the warehouse physical inventory journal, physical inventory journal and the physical inventory journal. So if you're using directed pick and put away, it'll populate both those journals. What you want to do is you want to post the warehouse journal first and then the physical inventory journal. You do not have to run the calculate warehouse adjustments from the item journal, okay? So we populate those journals automatically and you post them. And the advantage of that is by posting that physical inventory journal, instead of doing the calculate warehouse adjustments, we get physical inventory ledger entries, which is what you want for auditing and traceability and a whole bunch of other things, okay? So directed pick and put away people, you post the warehouse journal, then you post the physical inventory journal after that. All right, and the test report runs on the physical inventory journal. So let's have a quick peek, and then we're actually right almost on time. So what I would do at this point, once I've got this all set, I would copy the count to the journals, and that just copies everything to the batches that I've specified here, okay? I'm going to go into a different count. I'm going to go into this count where I've got a little more data for this location, and I'm going to copy everything over to the journals. So I'd hit copy count to journals. It comes up and lets me override any of the posting dates and all that kind of stuff if I really want. But I'm just going to go ahead. It says there's already items on that journal. I say I don't care. So I copy it over, and then I can deactivate this count. And that deactivate the count basically just turns off this active flag, which means I can't mess with the count anymore. But if we look at that journal that I copied, and again, if this was directed pick location, it would have also populated the warehouse physical inventory journal. What I wanted to indicate was this test report. So on the inventory count setup, if you go into that, it'll let you specify the InsightWorks test report instead of the standard NAV. And the big advantage of that is it's got these two checkboxes here: show error messages and show only lines with errors. So when I run this, it's a standard test report for the most part. It tells you, what's actually going to post, what the impact of the GL is going to be if I post this. But you'll notice down here, this 80100, it tells me that I'm not going to be able to post this batch because this guy is blocked. Now this is hugely advantageous, because if this was line number 9000 on this journal, I'd have to get to line number 9000 before it errored out. Then I'd yell and scream, go fix this. And then I post again, and then maybe line number 9001 fails. And then I start swearing and I go fix things and try and post again. So what this allows you to do is identify anything that's not going to post ahead of time, fix that up, and then you can post with a fair degree of confidence that it's actually going to work. So normally you would run it like this, and that'll give you a list of all the items you need to deal with, and you'd fix them up and then post normally.